All right, so where did this stuff all come from? So here's the other weird thing about cannabis, right? It's illegal now. It's been very much illegal for the last 80 years or so. But guess what? Before 1937, it was one of the most common, is one of the most common medicines and substances used throughout time, all over the world by every culture across the globe. This is really hard to find a culture whose history doesn't have cannabis involved in somewhere. The first cultivation dates back to 11,000 years ago. This is the Stone Age, and that is the cultivation of it, which means its use preceded that by a long, long time, right? So this is just evidence of it being gathered together and grown in one place. Our first evidence of psychoactive use are much later, but that's just our first evidence. It's not like we found the very first cultivated field or the very first evidence of psychoactive use. So it's unlikely it took people 8,000 years or more to figure out that it was psychoactive, but we find remains that old that suggest psychoactive use. And that's because there's burnt remains with the seeds still in there, and the seeds are very nutritious and valuable to plants and stuff like that. So why would you burn them if the purpose wasn't to burn the plant matter? As soon as they're medical textbooks, there's cannabis in it, as cannabis is one of the few words sharing roots across all these languages, which is a much earlier root. But again, forever, everywhere, throughout time, by everyone, for everything it could be used for. I mentioned this group, the Scythians, because there's a myth about cannabis that it induces happy, joyful, loving feelings. It's an excitatory drug. So whatever you're into, it kind of enhances that experience. So the Scythians, for example, observed by Herodotus in very early days, they used cannabis while drinking the blood from the skulls of their defeated enemy. So, again, it enhances whatever you're into. It's not necessarily going to make you feel loving towards others. There's a whole branch of crypto-biblical history that attributes the holy anointing oil to being cannabis because of its effects on demonic possession, which is believed to be epilepsy. I'm not saying yes or no there. I'm just saying it is ubiquitous in history. Cannabis is everywhere, and it doesn't even disappear from our pharmacies until the early 20th century. And then we got amnesia, and we just forgot about what it was used for, how it was used. And it didn't get brought along through the ride of the Industrial Revolution and get parsed out in the way that other pharmaceuticals have. So, something to know is that cannabis came into medicine, sort of more Western medicine, in the United States in the late 19th century. Okay, so this is kind of as I was saying, herbalism and stuff had been around for a long time, but at this time, sort of medicine started to be more commodified, and some research started to be had. There was more evidence-based results, although there were still a lot of things like leeches and cupping and bloodletting going on. So it's very much the Wild West in the 19th century as the Industrial Revolution came. And we had what was called patent medicine law came about. And that said, you have to label what's in your medicine, which is a good thing. But if you didn't speak English or couldn't get a patent, so let's say you were a traditional herbalist from another country, you're kind of out of luck. And these kind of medicines really came into fruition. You can see things like cocaine. Like Coca-Cola was chock full of cocaine. We had toothache drops for kids full of cocaine. It's a very good numbing agent, but you wouldn't want to give them to them at night. So we have heroin that was invented as a child's cough medicine by Bayer Pharmaceuticals, thank you. And thought to be safer because you could use lower dosages, but not really understanding potency. Kind of a mess, right? Um, Cannabis was not a stranger to this time in medicine. It was actually one of the most common ingredients in like everything. It works synergistically with a lot of other psychoactive drugs pretty well. And it's generally safe in mixing with other drugs. So it doesn't tend to raise the blood levels of things like opiates for the most part. This is not always true. But it would be, you'd have things like this. So it says cannabis compound, improved, no opiate, but 7% alcohol. And the second ingredient is chloroform. So just kind of a real hodgepodge out there. But there were cannabis things all by themselves. So you have powdered extract, fluid extract, topicals, infant relief. So even cannabis for babies. What you need to know is what was in here at the time is not, the cannabinoid content wasn't known, right? So they couldn't put percentage of THC or ratio of THC. They didn't have knowledge of THC or CBD. In fact, the first cannabinoid identified was CBN, which is an degradation product of THC. And the reason that would be the first identified is because that's what was predominantly in the active cannabinoid in these, because the way to activate the compound is you heat it. And they didn't have spectrographs to know how long to heat it, right? So the contents of what was in these medicines that we have all this historical anecdotal evidence of being really effective and helpful is not necessarily the same as what we're making today, especially when we're extracting individual cannabinoids out. They were missing a lot of it. It was the #1 treatment for tuberculosis. It got put into the American Pharmacopoeia, which is still a thing today, but it was later taken out in 1943, I think, something like that. It listed cannabis as a treatment for numerous afflictions, including neuralgia, tetanus, typhus, cholera, rabies, dysentery, alcoholism, opiate addiction, anthrax, leprosy, incontinence, gout, compulsive disorders, tonsillitis, insanity, excessive menstrual bleeding, and uterine bleeding, among others. How does in the world does it affect all of these things? Remember, I said it activates the endocannabinoid system, which is present in every organ system in the body. So it does have therapeutic potential on a very wide range of diseases. And its action is anti-inflammatory. You can cross a lot of those things off the list if you have an effective anti-inflammatory in terms of treating symptoms. It is antimicrobial for some types of bacteria. And again, we have evidence today in studies where just tiny doses over time can produce powerful sort of inner healing effects. So, for example, the presentation I was on Tuesday cited this case of a woman who had excessively high endogenous cannabinoid levels. So her body made its own cannabinoids at excessive levels. She had an insane pain tolerance to where she had a hand surgery without any anesthesia. Fine. So it's just, that is an incredible outlier, but it's an example of how powerful this body system is that is not taught in medical schools at all. There's a few programs across the country that are starting to do it over the last few years, but in general, not taught. And where we are in its knowledge is kind of, we are aware of its existence, but we don't have a strong understanding of how it works or what it does. So here we have cannabis is coming along as this very popular, very effective medicine. It is the #1 recommended medicine for chronic pain. And it is kind of one of those things that, like Tylenol, everybody's got some in their medicine cabinet. And it's not a thing that people, at least it was widely discussed, that people would use to get high. It was well known people would get addicted to cocaine and these opiate medicines like laudanum. I'm sure you've heard of that. But there aren't stories of people being addicted to Pizzo's cure, for example, or overusing cannabis-only medicine. Not to say that didn't happen. I'm just saying that it wasn't a common health problem the way addiction to these other drugs that were regularly available were. In fact, cannabis was used as treatment for addiction to opiates and chloroform and cocaine at the time. So, And so so somebody asked, what research am I referring to that cannabis is not physically addictive? If you remember what I said, I didn't say it's not physically addictive. It definitely produces some physiological symptoms. It doesn't produce physiological symptoms of medical concern. Okay, so nobody has to be hospitalized. Nobody's going to die from the withdrawals. And for most people, don't need any medical assistance with their withdrawal symptoms. They just lose some sleep. So again, I guess it's on my slide later on when I talk about cannabis addiction. There's a citation for the cannabis withdrawal syndrome stuff and its timeline, and you can take a look at that. But again, it doesn't produce withdrawal of physiological concern. People are physically uncomfortable. Some of them, especially if they're treating medical symptoms with cannabis, but they are not of medical concern. They don't need treatment necessarily. Most people, a lot of people don't suffer any symptoms, but if they're using daily, they're likely to have some difficulty sleeping and maybe be a little more irritable. So anyway, cannabis is, like I said, it's coming along, and it was well known that the cannabis plant could be used for a lot of things. I'm going to briefly tell you the story of prohibition here. But it was a very labor-intensive plant. So the cannabis fibers could be used for a whole bunch of stuff. It was very labor-intensive. The fibers had to be broken down by hand. So it was the number one thing for rope, for sails, for canvas. Like hemp was used for everything. It's incredibly durable fiber, makes great strong cloth and stuff like that, right? Did I say it's safer to use than other drugs? Yes, I will review some of that information. Just to have some patience until I get to that portion of the talk. But if you want to look ahead, you can look at the LD50 chart. You can look it up on Google or look in my presentation. That's a really good illustration of how it is dose for dose, the safest known, one of the safest known drugs, period. Anyway, so the cannabis is very valuable, very useful, very versatile plant, but is very labor intensive. That didn't matter, as everything was very labor intensive until the Industrial Revolution, when other things became less labor intensive. But also there was this thing that happened in the beginning of the 20th century called the Agricultural Revolution, where we started to make all sorts of new synthetic materials from plants. So like plastics and nylon, all from oil as well. From fossil fuels, we were able to make all this new material, and it was cheaper than breaking down hemp fibers by hand. So the Navy contracted with DuPont for rope, to make nylon rope, and William Randolph Hearst bought all this timber to start timberland in California to start printing more of his newspapers all over the country. And there were all sorts of new patents for pharmaceutical drugs that were replacing plant medicines. So what happened was a machine came out that was going to make hemp processing way faster. This was seen as a threat, and you guys can look this up all you want. This is absolutely how the story goes. Those people that I mentioned, including the leader of the alcohol, the tobacco, alcohol, the ATF at the time, conspired together to make cannabis undesirable. They invented a tax for which they didn't honor. They didn't allow anybody to pay and get the tax stamp, which essentially made growing cannabis illegal because you couldn't grow without this tax. That reduced orders from pharmaceutical companies and doctors, reduced their prescriptions, and it just fell out of favor. And state by state started making it illegal as well, along with the temperance movement and in the early 20th century and up through the Prohibition movement. And so by the 1940s, we have cannabis illegal and this sort of image of it. And this was all intentionally done by William Randolph Hearst. He put out all this crazy propaganda in his newspapers to eliminate competition. This is how we came to have antitrust laws, is because this stuff is very unfair. These people did not want to keep cannabis from the masses because of anything else than wanting to make money. It was just a way of them making money. It's not really about the cannabis, it's about their money. So this starts happening. And oddly enough, this is what really spread the knowledge of, oh, you can smoke it to get high. This campaign to stop that. And so this general knowledge came out. It's like, oh my God, what is our young people doing? We need to study this and understand this. The first study commissioned was by Mayor LaGuardia, by he asked the New York Academy of Medicine to take a look at cannabis use in the city and what it was doing to people. And they said, none of this stuff is true. It's not actually harmful. It doesn't seem to be the source of other drug problems. This is all rather unfounded. That was not taken seriously, and the prohibition continued. Now, keep in mind, cannabis was not illegal until 1970. So the Controlled Substance Act is actually what nationally made drugs illegal. State by state before that, and 49 states had done it, but and Alaska was the last at this time. But until then, cannabis was actually not illegal. And so this is where we get a big problem with the war on drugs, right? And so cannabis had been used for all this period of time without being known as a known source of harm to people. The story of that is really fabricated. And then the criminalization of it is then what ends up causing harm related to cannabis. It's not the use, but the activities that are associated with the acquiring and using of it because of its illegality. You know, we can go back and forth all day about that stuff, but that's where I stand on this issue, and I don't want to engage in an argument back and forth about that. So I just want to say that now. So question here: I've seen a video with babies whose mother had used cannabis during pregnancy. These babies were obviously going through withdrawal. The shakes. I don't. So Colleen, I'm not going to say it's untrue, but I also can't say that that's true, and that there's lots of reasons babies shake when they're born, but I'm not a doctor and I can't judge that from a video. There's lots of reports like that, and there are exceptions to every rule, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's safe for pregnant mothers to use cannabis, so please don't. It's not. There's lots of reasons why it's not. There's lots of reasons why it's not as dangerous as people think either. Will you share with us how we can order very low THC product that can maybe help with anti-inflammation? I would say use Google, Elizabeth. I'm not going to tell you any specific vendor or location, but in pretty much every state, you can order products that are under 0.3% THC by weight, and that can vary. You really need to pay attention to the ratio, though, because that could be a 10 milligram gummy, which would get you pretty high. So we'll talk about that stuff a little later. So 1970s when cannabis becomes illegal, and then our amnesia, starting 1937 is when our amnesia began with this. So remember, cannabis was the #1 prescribed medicine for chronic pain until that time, and then it changed to aspirin and opiates. Really let that drive home for you guys. Cannabis was the treatment for chronic pain for millennia, and this chronic pain, until the prohibition began, and then it was aspirin, acetaminophen, and opiates. So I just want you to let that sink in. How does cannabis use cause amotivational syndrome? It doesn't. Amotivation in cannabis can enhance amotivational syndrome in people, but it is not a cause of it itself. There are lots of highly motivated people that use lots of cannabis. So it is not a cause of amotivation, but there are certainly some people that are more susceptible to that. What's really important in cannabis use is your motivation for using it. So if you're using it to escape responsibility, it's going to do that for you. Was the change from not using cannabis to make products until the 20th century, was that due to white supremacy? Complicated question, but the general answer is yeah. I mean, white supremacy is the cause of all this SHIT, right? And in many ways, are the lack of honoring other cultures, their practices, and assuming that the Western white European method is the way, is the cause of many of our problems, and most certainly the war on drugs. Yes, I say that with great confidence. It's unfortunate. It's not what the presentation is about today, but it is an important factor in this whole story. So what I want you to also understand is that the study and knowledge of cannabis as a medicine didn't stop just because they created a law. The fact that it has anti-cancer activities has been known for 50 years, and we are no closer really than we were then. I mean, in certain circles we are, but not in the general knowledge, especially in oncology, of how cannabis can be helpful with cancer. There's a lot of work being done now, which is amazing. There are pairing chemotherapy drugs with CBD because it allows people to have lower doses of the chemo drugs to be more effective. It's really interesting, exciting stuff, and a specific type of CBD that actually works better. It's really interesting. The way medical use was sort of introduced into law actually started very early on in 1976 at a federal level, where this guy was arrested for growing pot in his apartment because he had glaucoma, and he defended himself successfully, saying there's no other good treatment. And they were like, yeah, you're right. Actually, we have this law in the books called the common law doctrine of necessity. It says if there is no other viable treatment, it's actually an injustice to withhold a substance from somebody. So ever since then, the government was supplying him and up to 13 other people with cannabis through the mail. Government grew cannabis and gave it to them. They grew it very poorly and gave them very poor quality cannabis. But they did that for many years until the AIDS crisis came out and knowledge of this program came out. They were overwhelmed with applications and they shut it down. They maintained providing to the people that were in the program, but they wouldn't allow any more members. I've been told by an immunologist that chronic cannabis use suppresses the immune system. What do you know about this? The jury is very out on that, but in general, the answer is no. It doesn't seem to suppress the immune system in a way that makes people get more sick. I cannot speak to that for people that are already immune suppressed. However, the fact that it is so helpful with autoimmune diseases doesn't mean that it's suppressing the immune system. It means it's suppressing inflammation of the immune system. And one of the things that's very interesting about that is it seems to be able to do that without suppressing immunity at the same time. Interaction between cannabis and extended release lithium treatments for bipolar. So the general consensus with cannabis use with bipolar is CBD generally fine for all states, but one shouldn't be taking oral cannabis with oral medications. It can be it's less harmful to smoke it with oral medications in terms of medication interactions. But in general, it's not recommended that these things be taken together anyway. But that's why we generally haven't heard a lot about drug interactions with cannabis, because it's traditionally smoked and it doesn't go through the liver that way. So it's less likelihood of that. But why are doctors who choose to approve the application of a medical card not required to learn specific facts about cannabis? Great question. In some places they are. Like DC has some required information. Some other states do, but many it's just they're required to know the law. And that's it. And it's actually the same for any other medicine. But doctors, when a new medicine comes on the market, they're not required to learn about it. They have continuing education credits, but they can choose what they want to learn about. They don't have to learn about every medication. It's up to their own responsibility that if they're going to use the medication with the patient, they should learn about it. I wish that was the case with more recommending medical cannabis doctors, but it's not. Let's see. Dr. Stone, Washington State documents cannabis impacts on lithium, and it makes lithium dump into the system all at once to trigger lithium toxicity. Okay, so again, that would be a good reason not to use them together. So when, especially oral cannabis can interfere with liver enzymes that process medications. So again, and I've been told by a psychiatrist that medical marijuana can make a diverse touch rock bottom. So can antidepressants, so can any medicine. There's actually a lot of evidence that cannabis doesn't necessarily do that. I'll show you some of that later, but those are kinds of statements that are really dangerous about cannabis, because the reality is you can apply that same statement to Prozac any other antidepressant, any antipsychotic, has the potential of paradoxical effect, right? Valium can cause paranoia to people. Ambien causes some people in a coma to wake up. So those kinds of blanket statements are what's called pharmacological determinism. They're dangerous. It's saying this drug affects everybody the same way, and that's 100% not true of all drugs. In fact, it even leads to the question, what is a drug, right? Versus a medicine, versus a plant, versus what are the differences between these things, right? So despite the fact that cannabis was prohibited, it remained incredibly popular. I picked this date because it's like right at the cusp of the blow up of dispensaries across the country. So about 2012, 2013 is when you really get dispensaries kind of becoming widespread. Before that, even though cannabis might be legal medically in your state, there was no legal way to get it many times. And so this is a sort of a capturing point of the height of the illicit market. And what we had is an estimate of $120 billion market value illegally. That is equal to alcohol or tobacco on their own at the same time. So where before there was too much money to let cannabis continue, there's too much money in the way now to let cannabis be prohibited. It's happening. It's not going to be rescheduled. That would mean everything all this industry that's come up would have to go away, and it all has to go behind the pharmacy counter. It's going to be descheduled. It's going to be, or it's going to go state by state. The cat is out of the bag. And so that's why I think this pretty statements like this are important no matter what. It's happening. Doesn't really matter how y'all feel about it. It's happening. You got to get on the train and get on board with the knowledge so you can be of best help to your clients, or they're not going to come to you for help. So this is sort of the evolution of medical cannabis across the country, state by state over the years. It's a nice, really illustrative graphic. And you'll see there's a big explosion point right about 2016 when I started doing my talks. Oh, I'm sorry, 2014. And then boom. And then boom. It's a big states go in 2016, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio.